Good morning and welcome to today's Audit Tuesday. The UATest podcast highlights developments on MSP hacks and liability and consequences. So to lead the discussion, we have cyber insurance specialist John Allen and cyber and GRC expert Peter Gailey, as well as noted cyber lawyer Cynthia Stamas will provide the legal counsel on this call as she does so well with her clients. So welcome everyone.
Morning.
Greetings.
Oh,
So first of all, Cynthia, can you please introduce yourself to the Audit Tuesday audience?
Hello, everyone. My name is Cynthia Stamas, and I'm an attorney based in Dallas that works across the country and actually across the world with healthcare, insurance, and other compliance and data-driven companies. And core to that is controlling their data both so that the business can operate and to control their liabilities. So I've been doing that for about 35 years.
And John, can you please introduce yourself as well?
absolutely. My name is John Allen. I have an independent agency, Community Insurance Advisors, and my passion really in that space is with cyber insurance. All of the risk categories that are out there, I think cyber is one of the scariest ones, and so that's why I want to spend time on that. I've been doing this for 18 years, and third career, and I love it. Absolutely love it.
Perfect. So Peter, please do the same, but especially can you talk about your experience and expertise in cyber and GRC for your clients?
Sure. Peter Gailey, Gailey Solutions, Dallas, Texas, but I'm virtual, anywhere in the U.S. We're a cybersecurity firm that specializes in helping both end users and MSP partners address a programmatic approach to reducing risk and meeting compliance. So what we do is we white label our services to MSPs, and we perform those same services to end user clients. Been in the business, been in the high tech business 47 years, specifically cybersecurity for about 10. GRC is part of that. Identity access management and governance is definitely part of that as well. Peter Gailey, Gailey Solutions.
And lastly, Garret, can you talk about yourself and why you had put this call together?
Yeah, Garret Grajek, identity guy, 13 patents in identity. Most relevant to the call is that created UATest, a identity a solution that runs in the cloud for identity compliance and security, and is specifically designed for the MSPs, for their clients and their own data. Let's get started, Ashley.
Perfect. So, Peter, you're the cyber expert. So, there was a story that hit the MSP press that alarmed the community, the Landtech MSP lawsuit. So, Peter, can you start with that and why that has alarmed the MSP community?
Sure. California-based, Sacramento-based law firm has been breached. This company, Landtech, I want to try to make it as generic as possible because it's in litigation and we don't know everything about it, but law firm and this MSP did a handshake on the relationship. So they didn't shore up their contracts. They didn't shore up their managed service provider kinds of contracts. You usually have a statement of work and then you have a master services agreement. They did everything in a handshake. Fast forward, law firm gets breached. The breach has a bunch of different ramifications. From what we think we know, there was identity access creep. So the MSP was providing its services. There's a breach. It happened to include ransomware. The law firm and the MSP went back and tried to recreate their data from backup copies from one of the industry standard, big players in the storage management space. They tried to do recovery. Turned out the instances were compromised on the service on the storage platforms. So that to me reeks of identity and access creep, credential creep. So it's a mess. And the law firm is suing the MSP for, I guess, not for providing services. They had a handshake, which is really, really risky. Cynthia is going to talk about that. John is going to talk about ramifications from a cybersecurity perspective. Garret is going to talk about the potential creep with identity access management governance. So this is a lawsuit that is unique in that to my knowledge, it's one of the first, potentially of many. The law firm is suing for $1 million plus worth of damages. It's a problem. So there's risk all over the place. The purpose that we teed up this call is, let's circle the wagons and figure out what the risks are for MSPs.
Perfect.
Figure out what the risks are for end user clients. That's in a nutshell what happened. So there's a bunch of there's a lockdown on it because it's in litigation, but that's what we think we know so far.
So, John, you're an expert in liability, E&O, and cyber insurance. Do you think this is a reasonable lawsuit? Does it have merit?
Well, without knowing the facts of the case, on the surface of it, it sounds like it could be. And really, a lot of what happened is preventable too. What we preach a lot of is in the cyberspace, in the cyber world that we live in, if you're going to be connected, you have to do connected world things. And that means that you do an assessment, you make sure you've got ongoing security protocols, you make sure you have an incident response plan, and then you figure out where insurance fits the gap. So really, I'm sort of the tail wagging the dog in this conversation. If you've got all your controls in place, then insurance would have paid for whatever the damages are for this sort of thing. But part of that process is that insurance is also going to require that you show that you've got controls in place, which then in theory would have prevented, if events played out the way we think they might have, would have prevented this from becoming more than just an attack, if that makes sense.
And Cynthia, the $1 million question, if not more. So is this type of lawsuit legit against the managed services that promise security?
Well, legit is kind of a funny word. It's kind of ultimately on a civil lawsuit, not only whether you get sued and whether they recover, sort of depends ultimately when you get all the way through the litigation. But are these lawsuits brought and are they successful? And most of them are settled at huge dollars, but they definitely have a foundation for traction in law. And what you've done before, during, and after affects not only the civil lawsuits, but also what many people don't recognize is the regulatory and criminal exposures that virtually every business owner and oftentimes their leaders often face. So you take that case, which is one of many. The lawsuits were one that has been managed service provider. People may not realize that the Healthcare Clearinghouse that recently had the breach, that's a subsidiary of United Health Group, Change Health, was a managed service provider. And those lawsuits are already being filed from all over, all directions, health plans, employers, healthcare providers, and this is not at all unique. So definitely it's important, but there's also, depending on what data is there, a whole host of other laws that give rise to, if you're a public company liability to your shareholders. And believe it or not, many electronic crime laws exist under federal law that require you to protect your data for managed service providers and their clients. And these controls are absolutely essential. There's a case called SolarWinds right now that is one example of places where the SEC has brought criminal liability against a public company, but there are also federal and state criminal and civil prosecutions by the agencies as well as the lawsuits. So it's not just about that. And yes, these lawsuits do have traction. We do have a number of judgments, and they can be tort laws, which is where you're suing for damages because of a violation of a standard of care, or they could be contract laws or deceptive trade practices, kind of breach of business standards laws, and a host of other things, as well as specific laws like under identity statutes and other data security statutes that give private causes of action.
And Peter, this goes right at the core of the MSP model to provide security and security services for customers, right?
It absolutely does. There's risk, and one of the issues, in my opinion, a major issue is setting expectations properly. In the fact that there doesn't appear to be a formalized contract in place, that is a problem because expectations are assumed. And we have a lot of players in the managed service provider space that are suggesting that they are providing cybersecurity. Now, cybersecurity is such a broad topic, and there are so many tentacles to it. Splitting hairs, what we provide generally is cybersecurity services that help a client reduce their risk and potentially meet compliance. So there's a nuance there. Providing cybersecurity means can be interpreted, I'm going to make you secure. Mm-hmm. And literally 90+% of the breaches and problems and everything that you hear is all people related. Cybersecurity is people, process, and technology. So the MSPs can provide the technology and some of the process. But in this case, it's relatively clear with the limited data that we have that there's a people component as well because of the access privileges, right? Of the change of access privileges that somebody could get into that third-party storage provider and corrupt that information, right? There's a lot of moving parts here. But yes, this plays right to the MSP community. One of the recommendations is going to be, hey, shore up your contracts, shore up your different insurance coverages. Again, John's going to get into that. But everybody should have a master services agreement. Here are the limitations of liabilities. Here's what the responsibilities are. Here's what we do. And then, so that's a general overview of your contract and your relationship. And then every project or set of projects or stack of deliverable services should be covered with a statement of work with guardrails on it. So you don't have hey, I'm providing cybersecurity, right? Nobody can do that. Not even IBM can do that, right? It's all a people, process, technology combination. Very complicated. And it's very dynamic. It's changing on a daily basis.
And Garret, let's talk about UATest. So this is why UATest is now offering its identity audit product to the MSPs on identity security, right?
Exactly. I love the way Peter, who's a known cyber guy, took this. He goes, there's a lot of facets to cybersecurity. Once upon a time, and many of the MSPs actually have been talking for the last couple of years, experts in MDR, experts in XDR, right? That dashboard that shows them, this has occurred, that's good, great. But hackers are doing identity attacks. This one's probably an identity attack. Let's hold off on judging on it, but that's usually what has happened.
Yeah.
People are attacking identities. And so what we did is we took our identity-based audit tool that looks for least privilege of users and then made it available to the MSPs so they can drill down on not only their accounts, but their clients' accounts and make sure that the identities are secure and not overprivileged.
And Cynthia, it's not just the MSPs that are encountering these lawsuits. So enterprises and their leaders holding sensitive information commonly face lawsuits, investigations, and in some cases, even criminal exposures after a breach, right?
Right. I mean, the layer of loss, contracts are only part of the issue. Contracts can set a standard, and everybody needs to understand specifically what things do and don't do. But when a client or a provider of these organizations gets data by law under federal and state law, the liability protections attach to the access to that data. And so whether or not you've agreed to it on contract, if you don't have a contract in place and you're the client, many times just simply allowing a service provider to have that data without the requisite contracts in place creates those liabilities. And I think one of the things people don't understand is that because data security is increasingly covered by these electronic crime laws, but you can have this also on compliance in a lawsuit context as well. So the rules work the same, but I think what really impresses people is to know that companies can be sued or they can be criminally prosecuted. And the law in the federal law that includes all these electronic crime laws, as well as things like the Fair and Accurate Credit Transactions Act, for people that have health plans or that are healthcare providers or take healthcare data from them, the HIPAA law, and a host of many others. Even your Internal Revenue Code has provisions like this that attach. And what people don't really think about is the federal sentencing guidelines say that if it's a felony or a class A misdemeanor under federal law, to violate those rules, which can be simply not having controls, including contractual, but operational and governance controls and responses in place, that the organization, and yes, even their leaders, can have imputed liability to them for the breach. And what happens under these laws is your liability exposure increases or declines based on what you've done before in terms of setting up contracts, your controls, your oversight, what you do when something happens, and whether you have appropriate responses then, and what you do in the cleanup. And so it can be hugely important for your damages, for your securities and exchange and shareholder liability, but it can actually mean the difference between your organization getting hit with criminal sanctions and, like in the case of SolarWinds or several others, whether the operators or organizers and leaders of that company also have liability. And for managed service providers, I want to remind that SolarWinds, the person that is most immediately charged is the chief security officer. So it comes home to these people selling technology and cybersecurity control services that it's not just about what they promise or don't promise, but it's actually under these criminal laws about what they do and don't do.
Perfect. So Cynthia, you mentioned SolarWinds. So Garret, let's talk a little bit about that. So I know the details are probably different, but there's similarities to the SolarWinds
Yeah,
hack,
and
right?
we know we love talking about that in this podcast. We had one of our best attended podcasts with a real great gentleman down in Oaxaca, Mexico, Peter Schwacker, helped dive into it. And we went into the actual claims. And this is where Cynthia's couldn't be more right. Where, yeah, there's civil lawsuits, but there's a criminal case against not only the company, but the CIO of SolarWinds. For what? For exactly what John in the insurance industry was saying. Hey, you need your evidence, right? If you're saying you're doing a certain action, you're saying that, yes, and I'll be specific here, I'm compliant, I should get insurance, I am legal because I'm doing, in SolarWinds' case, it was documented and signed by the CEO, Tim Brown, that he was doing two-factor, that he was doing SDLC, software development lifecycle management, and he was doing principle of least privilege. Okay, that's where we come in at UATS, where a company, if you're doing principle of least privilege, you need to show that you reviewed access to the sensitive data. You need to know. And I took a screenshot of Cynthia when she was presented to the LA ISSA. And, Cynthia is a great, listen to her talk for an hour. Great overview. She's talking, looking straight at the CIOs. And she's like, all right, if you don't have the evidence that you're performing this action, you're not doing the action when it comes to the law. And I know, John, that's the same way insurance too. So bottom line, wrap this up. Yeah.
Kind of said a different way, whatever arena you're in, there are controls.
Yeah.
And the issue is, if you're in HIPAA, there's, 100 and some odd controls, PCI 400, CMMC 110, plus another 100, whatever industry you're in, each one of those controls, you have to, number one, understand the control. Number two, you have to document policy that you are addressing and meeting that control. Number three, you have to have evidence and proof that you have done that. So, and John,
can I add number four, which is in both of these cases and every other case, too often what happens is people buy a control without understanding what to do, and they get data. And that's SolarWinds is not part of the problem in SolarWinds and this other cases. There were other prior alerts or reasons to know that there was a problem, which is almost always the case. And so the other thing you need to do is, and it's really good to do this with the assistance of counsel and attorney-client privilege so that you can have a candid discussion as you're planning, but also when these events occur, you need to have a reporting system documented where it reports up to your senior management. And then you usually want to have that report go into attorney-client privilege and investigate it and then come out and do your response so it's defensible, because the first thing that people generally do is go, holy gosh, or they think, well, unfortunately, because breaches and other events are so common, people don't investigate them because they get so many of them. And that is a large part of what's happening with these big liability, whether it's civil or criminal, is that they're getting in trouble because they have reports and resources, but they don't really know in their governance or don't have a process in place to understand how to use them, why to use them, and what to do with them. And when you work with a third party like an MSP or another party, and you're talking about these data issues, if you don't have an appropriate process in place for reporting an attorney-client privilege, the discussion actually becomes the evidence against you if you don't know how to manage.
Wow.
So there's policies. There is you got to kind of, from an MSP perspective, you got to kind of break this down a couple of different ways. So number one, I got to make this stuff together, right? So I have an operational component of how the heck am I going to patch cobble all of these services together, and then how am I going to offer them such that I reduce my risk and I increase my revenue flow, right? So you've got an architecture of a program, which is your GRC component. You have all of these projects, which is your stack and your deliverable and how you integrate them. Then you have the evidence that says, okay, I am doing these things properly, and I have proof that says that it is. And oh, by the way, I'm testing that, and here's my evidence, right? So there's very, very large projects involved in executing this from an MSP perspective.
Okay, John, so in the case of the MSP hack or breach, so the injured party, Mastagni, who is seeking $1 million in damages. So if the MSP is covered with insurance, they'd want this covered?
Well, there's first-party liability and there's third-party liability, and a good policy is going to have third-party liability coverage also. So in that case, yeah, they would be covered, assuming that they didn't lie or misrepresent on the application, as Peter outlined. But assuming you do your diligence and you go through the process of answering the questions properly and you have the right controls in place, then absolutely they would be covered in a case like this, right? I sit here and I listen to this. If I can make a comment on this, I listen to all of this, and all of these things that companies have to do sound really daunting. I spend most of my time with small and mid-sized businesses. I think one of the big challenges is that I don't know that anybody disputes necessarily the need for having these controls in place. I just don't think they necessarily always know how. It's really not as difficult to put them in place, and it's really not as costly to take care of these things as people think. I mean, you wouldn't buy a nice car and even think about not getting the oil change and doing ongoing maintenance. And I think if people start thinking about cybersecurity in the context of something, an ecosystem that they need to continually maintain and keep in place, because that's the price of admission in today's world, I think a lot of these issues that we're talking about here would have been avoided, to be perfectly honest.
But
I call that
John,
I call that a programmatic approach, John.
Right.
Yeah.
But John, one of the things that's really important about that is that it's important from an insurance standpoint to understand when we say you're going to be covered, there's defense coverage, and then there's also the liability coverage. And for example, in this case, we're talking about coverage for the negligence or other lawsuit from the breach against the MSP. But there's a whole bunch of other kinds of exposures, as we've talked about. And sometimes the cyber insurance covers it, and sometimes there's other insurance. I know we talked about that as we got to know each other. And so it's really important, both in terms of the front end working with legal counsel and others, to understand what your different levels of risk are, and then to understand who does what and what's going to be covered, what's not to, and where your interfaces need to be. So you need to do that, and then sit down with a really good insurance person, because the damages usually are not the big part of the expense on these things. It's the investigation and the remedies, and that's necessary not just for these things. The other thing is that there's a practical bar for small companies to the civil negligence or other kinds of lawsuits. It's called bankruptcy. What most people don't realize is why the Securities Exchange Commission put these new rules in place is that companies that experience cyber breaches that result in these kinds of problems go bankrupt. And that's why they have all these other lawsuits. So if you do have a problem, in addition to doing the things to mitigate your risk, you need that insurance so that you can do the things you have to do when a breach happens or an attack happens, so that you can remediate that without going bankrupt. And you need a whole package of insurance to do that.
Right. And the thing about
one of the things, John, jump in here, but one of the things when you have cyber security insurance, whatever the components are, one of the first phone calls is to your insurance agent. And they bring in the team of experts to help you figure out, number one, what the heck happened? How did it happen? What do we have to do?
Well, actually, Peter, I would say to you that while that's an important component, because of the criminal liability that's involved, you probably need to talk to a lawyer before you do that, because all of that discovery is unprivileged and you don't really want that going forward. And so step one is, although I hate to say it because it sounds self-serving, but if you don't understand attorney-client privilege, when you have a risk manager, whether it's a consultant or an insurer or some other vendor, including an MSP, doing your internal breach and data event response, and you haven't talked to your lawyer first, everybody involved is at risk because you're all basically jointly exposed to liability for that activity. And if the people don't understand that, they can be exposed to liability. But also,
thanks,
because
Cynthia.
when the minute
I
that
knew I
event
want to have you on
happens,
this call.
the finger
Good going.
pointing starts happening. It's not just about protecting you, it's about protecting them. And sometimes the most important thing you can do to protect yourself, in fact, Garret can tell you, is that at the end of the day, if nothing else fails, make sure you can prove it's somebody else's fault. And that happens from word go.
Right.
The contract starts that, but the minute the event happens, you have to put on that defensive hat. And the lawyers will come in and structure that. But let me be clear, lawyers that are actually competent there do not do cybersecurity investigations. In fact, it would not be appropriate for us to do this even if we have the skill. What we do is help you structure it to use the legal rules, the contracts, and the other things to mitigate your risk. And then we go to somebody like Peter or John's internal risk people at the insurance company, and we help you bring those things together and use them to the best umbrella defense we can help you get.
Yeah, and then I would say after you talk to your attorney, the first person you want to talk to is your incident response team, right?
Nice.
So when we set you up with an
your
insurance
attorney's probably
policy,
going to call them for you or help you call them for them. That's right.
There you
And
go.
it's talking in general, you're talking probably anywhere with somebody who really knows what you're doing, you're talking about they will know how to respond. So they're going to say, you're probably talking less than 30 minutes between the time you call your lawyer and the time that you start doing that response and lining those things. But that 30-minute orientation can make a huge difference.
So let me bring this back down to reality with the size of the clients that we're addressing here, the MSPs. By far and away, the MSP community is revenues less than $1 million or $2 million a year. So having all of these resources available is something that they have to do and anticipate that these things are going to happen. But one of the real keys, and you just hit it right on the head, Cynthia, and John, is one of the absolute fundamental building blocks of being an MSP and running your own IT shop is that you have an incident response disaster recovery plan in place, tabletop, practice. Oh my, what happens when something happens? Okay, we've identified the RACI model, who's responsible, who's accountable, right? And literally have practiced that. So again, that's kind of more of an operational side of it, but fundamental in business in the IT world, specifically in cybersecurity, have an IR and a DR program in place, documented, and off you go.
Well, and Peter, to that point, not only should you have that internally, whether you're the client or the MSP, but when we build contracts, we also build in protocols into the contract. So one of the problems with the way contracting is done on data security historically is you do have this master service agreement, then you have these scope of work agreements, and then these data things in most of these contracts are kind of cobbled on to other liability, indemnification, investigation, and all these other things. And that oftentimes creates a problem because they're internally conflicting, but also because, as Peter's talking about, you need a very clear response. And so when you think about, should you take the extra time to actually fit your stuff together? The answer is yes, because that is the roadmap that tells you, one, you call the lawyer, two, you call the incident response team, three, this is how you do it. And it's a step-by-step guide. And so this practice, well-intentioned, of people trying to mass produce and cut and paste contracts is one of the problems why people don't know what to do, is because they don't define whose job it is up front. And then when the fur hits the fan, they look like a bunch of chickens with their head cut off. And that's how you get trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. I know Ashley has a question for John about what has to be done even prior. So take it away, Ashley.
Yeah, so John, we talked about this in prep. So it's not just a matter of the insurer just writing a check after the event, right? So the enterprise has to provide the evidence of due diligence that they promised when they first purchased the insurance, right?
Yeah, pretty much. That's part of the part of the investigation. But I want to go back to a point that was made earlier about the insurance and what's in it. You can't just buy a generic, I guess you could buy a generic cyber policy because they're all created differently. And the insurance coverage for cyber has evolved over time to where now it's almost like a cafeteria plan, if you think about it. So it's got all of these different sublimits of liability. Some may address social engineering, some may address ransomware, some may address all of these different components of things that can go wrong. And so, if I go out and I put out a quote request to a brokerage that specializes in cyber and I get 10 quotes back, all 10 of them are going to look different. So the trick is to look at what have I identified as an MSP in particular as, I know where the kinks in my armor are, as it were. I know what I'm taking, what steps I'm taking in terms of defensive measures to make sure I don't have a problem. But if something is going to break, I know where it's most likely, and where does the insurance cover that specifically? And that's part of this process about, discussing up front, if I'm going to have a problem, what am I going to do about it? And that's why you have to engage these conversations. I will tell you that of all the different classes we write for cyber, that MSPs are one of the more difficult classes to find a home for because of the vulnerabilities, the inherent nature of what they do. Insurance companies are more afraid of MSPs generally than they are of a lot of other risk classes. It's not because MSPs are bad people. It just means that because of what they do, there's a lot more things that can go wrong in their operation than other types of, say, manufacturing, other cases, right? So that's all the more reason why there needs to be more diligence there. Sorry, go ahead.
When I was out at the ABA Cyber Conference speaking a few weeks ago, we were really excited that there were a number of liability carriers. And the thing that I walked away with that I just wanted to mention here is this is a great time to do an insurance liability checkup and reassess the adequacy as well as the costs. Because they said in the last 6 months, and I know when I got my cyber stuff, it was, it was very expensive. They told me go back to the market now and do an insurance checkup now. And so I just wanted to mention, if you've looked at this in the past, the rates apparently have stabilized and even come down in some events. And so we encourage people as part of the planning process to do a checkup with a really well-qualified, knowledgeable insurance broker with these areas, and a holistic one of their overall insurance, E&O, D&O, all these crisis things, as well as cyber in an integrated way, and do a map of what covers what, and then quote it out with somebody that knows well what's the pricing in the market.
And it costs you nothing to do that. That's the thing about it. Insurance is kind of complementing what the IT world is telling you in terms of cyber controls, right? So IT is going to come at you and tell you different things that you need to do about cyber. HR, if they're paying attention, really is going to be telling you about what kind of behaviors you have to have. And insurance is going to ask you these questions. And when you think about it, the questions that insurance companies ask you, it's for a reason. It's because they paid claims for things like that are broken. So it's kind of like going into a class and getting the test results, the teacher's scorecard beforehand. If the insurance company is asking you, then it's probably something you ought to pay attention to, right?
But you do want to do that in the scope of privilege before you give it back to your carrier, both because you want to make sure you understand and respond properly, because if you respond improperly, then you can compromise your coverage. But also because a lot of times there's things that they ask about, which would be in a perfect world, everybody would do all these things, just like in a consulting world, everybody would. But you may or may not be doing them, or you may have to have some sensitive conversations about whether you should be doing them and why or why not. And those conversations are also things you don't want out there hanging in the public space. But I love this checklist. And the other thing I was going to say about that, and John, I invite you to come back and say that as well. But in my experience, by doing that, the process of due diligence, not only get your insurance rates down, but if you get preferential insurance rates because you use all the risk management, you also have gotten those because you've reduced your risks. And I'm not going to say if, I'm going to say when you have a problem, because in today's world, whether you know it or not, you have a cyber problem every day. If somebody got an email today that said your password, that their password isn't working, you have an event that's a red flag that needs to be investigated theoretically. And so it might be like me with my blonde hair, that it's just idiot alert, but somebody has to address that. And so I love it when people use all of the free resources they can get, as long as they use them knowledgeably. And that's why we really, really think this is a good idea to include as part of your risk plan.
Yeah.
Good point.
So,
Take it
John, the insurance forms actually have questions on enterprise security and practices, right?
Yeah, so kind of think of it in two layers. There's sort of a surface cursory kind of a basic questionnaire that especially small businesses will use, but almost always the underwriter is going to want a more detailed questionnaire. And depending on what kind of company it is that's applying for the coverage, the questionnaire might be different, but some of those questionnaires can be pretty detailed. And I would tell you that most people can't answer those questionnaires without the help of either an attorney and or a cybersecurity person that really understands, what's the question about and what's the nuance of the question, right? And because you want to make sure you answer it properly.
And
I would
John,
look at
we
it
had
as
our inside sales is posting one of your forms that you were nice enough to provide to us
Awesome.
on
Great.
LinkedIn right now for the audience. Take it away.
Yeah. Most people get kind of the cross-eyed look when they look at it, but it illustrates the point about why it takes a team to manage this. You can't just assume you're going to check boxes like in the old days and then you're going to get covered. If you check a box, you check it wrong, you're setting yourself up for failure. It just doesn't make sense. And the other thing I would tell you is that if you go through that process and you find 2 or 3 things that you've got gaps in, this is your opportunity to remedy those gaps, whatever that means, right? It may be that you fix it, or it may mean that you go back and you declare to the marketplace, you know what, there's certain things that we are not as an enterprise going to do, and you need to know that. You need to sign off on this before it becomes a problem, right?
That's as long as the law allows you to do that too. But otherwise, you're just publicly confessing your guilt. But
but
and
you know what I'm
that's the
saying.
problem. It's so messy, but the process of trying. Never underestimate the process of showing that even if you didn't execute it perfectly, you tried, because that definitely can make a huge difference, whether you're talking about getting sued, keeping relationships with the community and your customer base, or dealing with those prosecutors.
So
John,
from a cybersecurity perspective, you have a couple of different areas. Number one, security first, always for your company, right? And then you might have a couple of filters. You might have an industry certification filter that, depending upon the industry that you're in, you have X amount of controls that you need to meet, whether it's HIPAA, PCI, FedRAMP, FISMA, pick your industry kind of thing. So that's another lens that you would look at all of these controls. And then thirdly, Garret said we just kind of posted something on the website. Another filter is going to be your cyber insurance, right? You are not, if you're just checking the box in the cybersecurity application, you're taking huge risk. And again, we're back to the evidence-based. So I think if it's the same form, we just kind of randomly looked at some of the categories. There was general business, like size of business, industry, network access, identity access, data classification. There was a ransomware specific set of controls, email integrity, remote access, multi-factor authentication, antivirus, phishing controls, training, right? Others, money management controls, identity access management to money, who gets to the checkbook kind of thing, right. Media liability. These are all projects, right? And if you just say, oh yeah, I have a media liability strategy, and you don't, you may get denied. Something happens and you have huge risk, and you did a checkbox because you just thought you had it. Huge problems, huge risk.
Some of these things that happen too for smaller organizations, you can work with knowledgeable advisors. Peter, I know you probably think through these things with your background with them, but like, for example, you might use and invest a little bit more in maybe a Microsoft 365 eCloud with monitoring. Because one of the things about these things is, and it just struck me listening that I know Peter and I've talked about this, but this is not a static, you do it once or twice a year. One of the problems is the cyber threat is constantly evolving. So when you're setting up these controls, you're really setting up processes to monitor. And I know as an attorney, if I had to monitor all the changing threats that come out every day, we used to have our own servers and our own cyber people internally to do that. And even though we had really dedicated and outstanding, hugely credentialed people, we decided to start using some of these high-level professional resources and actually paying a little bit more for the things like the big companies and the NSA does, because it's impossible to really monitor them. And so when my cyber people came back with those questions on the underwriter, my buddies at Microsoft Cloud sent the book to them and said, if you haven't read this, you probably need to, because she's on the same stuff that NASA, NSA, DOD. And so one of the things that you can do is remember, this is an ongoing thing. Ransomware threats are emerging and constantly evolving. And if you look at NIST or CISO or some of these other things, which are the people the government reports, there are thousands and thousands of these reports coming out every day. It is not something that a small business person or even our law firms and many of our major businesses and our government people think they can keep up with. So consider working with the folks like Peter.
Cynthia, not only can the businesses can't give up, NIST just released that they're having trouble getting out the CVEs, common vulnerabilities and exposures.
So if you buy a better product, if you buy a better solution, then you probably, even though it costs more at the end of the day, don't have to buy as many of them, because the prudent, that element can be done. So sometimes it's cheaper to pay for a better product than pay for a lawyer and a bank of consultants.
Nice.
Absolutely.
Nice.
Well, you're talking, this whole cyber world is a highly coordinated process, really, right? And it's like buying a really expensive piece of machinery. And if you're going to play in this space, then you have to invest in it, and you have to cultivate, and you have to maintain it, and you have to do these things. And I really think that what makes the most sense is to get an outside security company that's got the access to much more robust tools that really, you can hire much stronger people, if you will, on a fractional basis, as opposed to trying to do all that stuff internally, right? And I just think that's, especially the smaller the business, the more that makes
you
sense.
just need to credential them. And part of the credentialing includes, do they have enough wherewithal that if something happens, because if they have a breach or deficiency, it's not just going to be you, it's going to be somebody else. And when you're a managed services provider, that's something that's important to remember too, is you may need to carry more insurance liability risk, because you have more risk, because you're not just managing your own data, you're managing somebody else's, and they're all going to be coming after you if something goes wrong. But it's easier to spread that risk at that level than it is at each individual contract level.
Yes, it is. So can I say one thing? I don't know if we're getting off script here a little bit, excuse me, but I think we're scaring the daylights out of a lot of people with all this talk about all of the things that can happen. And I think the truth is, I think if you consider cyber risk a financial challenge, and you look at, all right, if I invest whatever I have to invest every year to manage cyber, I'm making up a number. Let's say it's $50,000 a year between outside monitored services, insurance, whatever that number is, right? And this is for a fairly small business. How does that cost compare to what I stand to lose in the event that I have a breach? And if I have a breach, if that breach costs me, say, $2 million, how many years do I have to save the $50,000 it's going to cost me to maintain that security versus paying the $2 million that it's going to cost me when I have a problem? Right. And I think we have to be thinking of it that way. All of the technical elements that we've talked about on this call are absolutely valid, but there's a place for that where the technical people, the attorneys, people that deal in cyber insurance, we can all isolate that conversation. The bigger picture thing is my organization truly safe? And so I want to make sure that whoever's listening to this call, that you understand, at least get started, at least look at it, at least do, fill out a questionnaire and at least find out where you are, and then make a decision about how you're going to attack it. Right, but you have to attack it. You can't just leave it unchecked.
John, you have a point.
That's an excellent. Go ahead, I'm sorry, Gary.
Go for it. I was going to say, John has a point. Take it, Cynthia, then I'll go.
Well, I just want to say also, managed services providers, when we go back to the very first where Peter was talking about define what you do, sometimes what we do with those organizations is, instead of being the data hoster, is to provide an integrated set of tools and then carefully contract with it. Because one of the things you can do is control your risk or reduce your liability by providing the tools and focusing on that, but not focusing on the data. In essence, you're leasing out those services and providing consulting services. And what I find is a lot of organizations take on more risk than they really need to. But when we work with them, we can organize that back and at a win-win way that works with their clients as well. It's just a much more accurate reflection of what they do. So remember, the data is I would say like nuclear waste with a shelf life of 100 million years. It's out there once it's gone. That is the dangerous stuff.
It's all about data.
Yeah.
So I was going to say we have kind of a blessing and a curse in the cybersecurity world, and it's an interesting trade-off. Is that there are multiple what are called frameworks that are best practices wrapped, that industry specific or sometimes relatively generic industries. The best thing to do for a small company or an MSP or an MSP is to work with an expert, understand what is the best framework for me to build my cybersecurity program around. So Cynthia has mentioned NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technologies, okay? The inch, the meter, the foot, or the inch, the foot, the pound, right? Those are all national standards. NIST has thousands of standards. One of them happens to be cybersecurity related, okay? So if you are in the process of being scared, as John is saying, go back, get a baseline of where you are, figure out what industry you're in, figure out which framework you should be involved in, and start from scratch. And here's what we're doing. Here's what we need to do. Put a program together. Each one of those controls, right? Each one of those areas is a project. You've got to prioritize those. And I call it just like bowling. You set them up, you knock them down, you set them up, you knock them down, you set them. And it's just a series of projects to try, as Cynthia says, right? If you're not trying and you have a big, huge breach, you're done. If you are at least trying, then you'll get some empathy, right? You may still be done, but again, so the frameworks and, difference between frameworks and standards. Frameworks are best practices. Standards are very specifically measurable controls. Yeah. So let's there.
Do this, Peter, we got some questions coming in. I know I actually had one more question for John and then one other, and then we'll do the prepared questions. Take it away, Ashley.
Awesome.
So, John, if the company, including the MSP that got breached, was inaccurate in their filing and the insurer can show that the security mechanism was not in place, then the insurer might threaten not to pay. Is that correct?
Threaten? They'll do more than threaten. They simply won't pay it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
They'll just decline it based on that. They're very non-emotional about it. They're very direct.
Wow.
Which is why you can't.
That was more of a blunt answer than you expected, wasn't it?
Which is why you can't just check the box. You can't check the box.
Yeah,
you gotta have evidence.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, let me just use the words. You're going to hear people from the other side as we talk about the documentation. And most commonly used documentation is either a risk assessment and a risk crosswalk. And so at the different stages in your process, you basically not only go through the checklist, but you document. And this is why you need to do it in privilege, your analysis, maybe talk with Peter and you get your responses, you do inquiries, and you take all that stuff in. And then the leadership actually has to document their analysis and decision-making to show their effort to make sure this is done. And there are different points along the way that you have to reinitiate those risk crosswalks. So for example, when you put in a new piece of software, or if a vendor is going to put in a new piece of software. So the point being that you have to do all these things, but as Garret was going to talk, you also have to have documentation together. And MSPs need to do that themselves internally, but they also can really help their clients downstream by systematizing that and then also making it available, showing that they're doing it for their clients to do it, etc.
So that, you just played into my hand perfectly. That risk assessment generally There are multiple kinds of risk assessments. Number one, a risk assessment, ITIS looks at people and process. A vulnerability assessment or an enhanced vulnerability assessment is a technical assessment, credentialed access inside to discover your network. And then there are various kinds of penetration testing, which are outside breaking in. So you do all of those assessments and you come up with, here are my vulnerabilities. Here's what I'm strong at. Now let's prioritize, put a program together, address those vulnerabilities. Monitor, manage, rinse and repeat. That's a program.
And Garret, so we mentioned UATest before. So UATest is an identity and access control product as well as a governance service. So is it itemized in the insurance form that John shared?
I exactly like where Peter took it, right? All this stuff. And the first line of the form, the first line on the insurance form says, does your enterprise hold sensitive data? All risk-based auditing starts from there. Look at Peter. He's nodding his
All
head.
about data.
That's what he does. The cyber guy goes out there and says, hold it. Oh, before the noise of your controls, before the noise of what you're doing, what data are you holding? And that's exactly what UATest does for the MSP.
It's not just holding it, though. It's does your organization touch the data? Because if you touch the data, you could be enjoined in some sort of action as well, right?
Nice. So it starts with data. Let's just agree on that.
It's all about data.
You're processing data, and then all the regulations, the guidances from this Peter was itemizing, right? The guidance is from this, but the regulations that state if you are processing data, if you have access to data, if users can see data, right? You have to quantify, you the MSP on this call, you have to quantify who actually has access, and you have to be able to give the evidence of why and who got that access and why they have access to that data. And that's exactly what we do at UATest.
And data takes many, many different forms. So you have a network topology, that's data, right?
Nice.
You have your contracts, that's data. You have your HR information, that's data. It's going to be, spread all over your organization. It's all about data.
You have access to the source code, which is like the keys to the universe, but they always send you breach notifications saying, we don't think any data was breached. It was just the source code. It's like, it's just the key to the safe. No worries. But, Garret, I do think one of the things I heard from your comments that I also thought was really important is we tell people follow the data. Peter's correct that there's a lot of industry standards, but those are guesstimates based on the industry you're in, what data is. The law and liability looks at the data. So if you employ people, you have sensitive data. If you take credit card payments or have bank drafting payments, you have sensitive data. So what you really do is follow the data and then look at the rules and the risks that attach to it. And then you also look at the systems that you have access to. And that's where you define your liability and how things go. And so being able to not only do that, but audit it and then constantly look at any changes.
Nice.
And the controls and the policies and the procedures and the documentation and the evidence that proves you have all of that chain of custody for data in place. Very important.
That's our Audit Tuesday next week is triggers on data and data control. Ashley, why don't we take some of the audience questions?
Perfect. So first question is for Cynthia. So assumed liability versus explicit liability. So what's the difference?
Well, from a legal standpoint, explicit liability is liability where the law says if this happens, you are liable. But assumed liability actually tends to happen to be more of the places. And then you can also have a concept of assumed liability in a different way, which is you can assume the liability by contract or indemnification. And I think there's a third way in reality when you look at the emerging law and case law and enforcement, and that is when you assume the data, you assume some liability today. So if you assume data access, possession, control, or the credentials to get there, and that's because the law gives those other things. So the question's a little bit, it depends on how the question's asked, but all of those things. But explicit liability is either the statute or the contract says you will be liable for that if this happens.
And you mentioned earlier criminal exposure. So can you expand on what you mean by that?
Yeah, so the federal sentencing guidelines, most common people in the United States understand the federal sentencing guidelines from seeing, drug traffickers or something getting sentenced for several years. But there's some rules in the federal sentencing guidelines called organizational liability. And it's basically criminal vicarious liability, liability that you don't actually have to perform the criminal act to become liable for it. And as I mentioned before, those apply to Class A misdemeanors and felonies under federal law for the most part. And it could be a whole bunch of things. It could be OSHA, or it could be wage and hour willful violations. But in the data set things, there are a whole realm of laws that require that you not disclose it and you protect data. And so in those, in Title 18 of the United States Code, there's just a whole series of laws in Section 18 about electronic crimes. HIPAA has one of those, Gramm-Leach-Bliley and these other things feed back into it through FACTA. Anyway, so when you get to those things, whether you realize it or not, if there's a breach or malware or data, or even responding to a ransomware attack, because the ransomware attack, there's things under the Patriot Act that say you can't pay money without the IRS and the Department of Justice's consent for those. So those all things trigger potential felony or Class A misdemeanor liability. So the way the sentencing guidelines work, if an organization does it, or somebody within their organization does it, or if they had a duty to prevent it and didn't do the things they were supposed to do and it happens. So if a hacker comes into your company, or you get a ransomware attack and you're sitting out there like a sitting duck, or maybe have ignored red flags, you could be liable because you have an affirmative duty under that code, and your failure to take the steps necessary to control it makes your organization liable. But what people also don't realize is whether they're the CISO, the CEO, the board of directors, the service provider or consultant working to them, when these things happen, you also have a duty to respond, either to prevent. And so if you say, well, we're just not going to put that stuff on that because that'll cost us more than our annual operating budget, or when there's a breach, like what happened in SolarWinds or some of these other things, and you've ignored it, and you've not taken the steps, or you've not reported it, or you've not done the other things, and you're an individual in the organization who knew about that or had responsibility for knowing about that, there are rules where you also personally can incur liability for that. And so it's a way that the law holds people accountable, because organizations can't go to jail. So what tends to happen is individuals and organizations go to jail. Now, if you're a public company, there's other rules for senior executives and things under the SEC laws, for example, as well. But that's how criminal liability attaches to those folks, is because they are the captain of the ship. And so this is why you also want to make sure that you have this overall process. And if somebody's pushing back or saying we're not going to do that, you want to have appropriate conduct to address why what you're doing should be looked at good enough. Because when those things happen, both for your organization and for those leaders who are responsible for it or participated in it, that's going to be what people like me and the white collar criminal lawyers use to beat back that liability, so you don't have to spend a significant time in orange.
All right, just a time, we're probably running a little over audience or so, but why don't we take one or two more questions, Ashley, and then we'll get back to people directly, and we'll let the panelists express how they can be contacted. Take it away.
Sure. So next question is for Peter. So do you have recommended contract templates for MSPs to use for their statement of works that include good cyber language?
No. You should come up with your own. Every service provider stack is going to be different, and you should definitely engage a lawyer, or you should definitely customize it. There are some templates out there you can find on the internet, but that's 20% of the contract or the statement of work. No, I would not go with boilerplate kinds of contracts. I would take that and maybe give that to a lawyer and have them tweak it, but it's probably, I call it bad practice. That's not a good thing. Cynthia?
Oh yeah, Peter, by the way, people don't often realize that when you bootleg other people's contracts, the people that bought those contracts have a copyright in them. And that in itself is one of those things that triggers both civil liability and potential federal sentencing guidelines
Wow.
liability. So not only may they not be worth the paper they're written on, but there are common things about what should be in them and some examples. And I know on my website, there's some things to look at, things like that, and just to think about questions to ask, due diligence. I bet Peter has some of those as well.
Yeah.
And the American Bar Association has a lot of those resources available in the intellectual property section, as well as in the TIPS Cyber Liability Committee.
So that's
Perfect.
a tricky question, but yikes.
Oh, good answer. Yeah.
I'm very proud of you,
So-
though, Peter. You're right. You have to put them together to fit what you're doing. And the process of putting together is also part of the proof of that due diligence.
Right.
Okay, next question's for Garret. So how many CISOs feel like implicit trust of having an MSP, MSSP manage their cybersecurity? It also removes their own liability if something goes wrong.
Yeah, let Cynthia and the others take liability, but straight out, audience, if from the inside, there's huge differences in the way MSPs handle their cybersecurity and handle this cybersecurity, especially around data. Because we're under the covers, we're working with them, and the way I'm seeing it, and I'm not saying that it has to be this way, but a cool way I'm seeing the good MSPs is they go, okay, we can give you services. And the old school way was, what do they count? Peter knows this. They counted devices. And we're going to charge you on how many devices, and here's your package. What is that? That means they give you your malware, they give you some MDR that's going to look at, threats that come in there. Rock and roll. Nothing wrong. Not disparaging that stuff. Okay, the forward-thinking MSPs that we've been working of late are saying, okay, let me count your identities. I don't care if they got devices. I mean, because they got
Right.
data in clouds. They got SaaS apps. They got IaaS apps. This identities are your cost, right? They're your cost. And what they do is they look at you and they go, okay, rock and roll. All right, what do you want? What's your thing? Is Peter would say is whatever you always start your risk. What's your risk? Okay, you're in healthcare. He's got all these identities and they have access to PHI. Okay, your cost is going to be this because we're going to bundle, and this is the MSP talking, we're going to bundle, of course, we're going to have two-factor, of course, we're going to have a secure IAM, so of course, we're going to have something like UATest where we can review your access rights and do your audit reviews, and that's a bundled cost. So the answer to the question sitting here is yeah, there is a trust of the MSP, but you have to investigate. You have to do your due diligence and see if that MSP actually is doing the work because they are handling your data and handling the reputation of your enterprise. I'll leave it at that.
Can I
Yeah.
take a cut at that answer?
Please.
If you're a CIO or a CISO or a CEO, yeah, you can try to push the risk elsewhere, but trust me, you're on the hook, right? It's your company, and you're deciding what supply chain people you're working with, whether it's you're buying engines for cars or you're buying MFA for your systems, right? You're on the hook for that decision, and you have choices amongst a bunch of different vendors. So no, there's you've got to make informed, intelligent, risk-based decisions, period.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I think I
Okay,
agree
I
with
think
both
we
of
have
them
Sorry,
Awesome.
on the
Cynthia.
liability. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. We do need to wrap this up. So John, can you tell the audience how to reach you?
Yeah, can I give out my email address or website?
Yeah. Yeah.
Of
Okay,
course.
yeah, website is Comins Advisors, COMMINS advisors.com. And my email isjallen@comminsadvisors.com. You can also call me. If you look me up online, it should be pretty easy to find.
And Cynthia, can you tell the audience how they can reach you?
Well, we have a website, cynthiastamer.com, as well as the firm's website, which is solutionslawyer.com. The data research, if you want to look for papers and publications and things like that, is still on the Cynthia Stamer. We're in the process of tightening up new stuff. And you can email me at cstamer, STAMER, at solutionslawyer.com. And thanks so much for letting me participate today.
Thank you for being here. And Peter, can you give out your contact information as well?
Sure. Gailey Solutions, Gailey, solutions.com, or peter@gaileysolutions.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. I have a LinkedIn business page. I have a website. I want to interject one thing. John, you've got that cost calculator that you might want to talk about for 1 second.
Yeah, real briefly, my website has a link to a data breach calculator. There's several of them out there. We link to one of them. And it gives you a sense for, if you had a data breach, what is that likely to look like in terms of cost? Very worthwhile exercise. Takes maybe 20 seconds to do.
Might want to circle that back into the content of.
Yeah, if you're not sure how to find it, call me. I'm happy to help you.
Perfect.
And
then
by the
we
way, thank you also.
Yeah, thank you for being here. We appreciate it. So we at UATest can be reached at uatest.com, or just write us at info@uatest.com. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to the audience for coming and for all your questions. We really appreciate it.
Good stuff.
Thank you.
Thanks,
If
folks.
you write us, we'll get you to the contacts, and we also will be posting their email addresses in the LinkedIn live page. Yes. Okay.
Thank you all.
Thanks, team. That was a lot of fun. All good.